She cooked meals for the same outlaw gang that killed her husband. Until one night, the stew tasted different. The kitchen was dark before dawn, just the way Mary preferred it. Her hands moved without thinking, cutting potatoes into perfect squares while the world outside still slept. The knife made soft sounds against the wooden board, the same board Thomas had carved for her their first winter together. She could still see the place where his thumb had slipped, leaving a deep groove in the corner. Some mornings, she pressed her finger there, feeling for the ghost of his mistake. The stove needed wood. She fed it piece by piece, watching the flames catch and grow. Orange light danced across the walls, making shadows that looked like reaching hands. This was the hour she remembered him best, when the kitchen belonged only to them, before the ranch woke up hungry and demanding. He would stand behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "Morning, beautiful," he'd whisper, his voice still rough with sleep. Then he'd steal a piece of whatever she was cutting, dodging her wooden spoon with a laugh that filled the whole room. Now the kitchen held only silence and the smell of burning wood. Outside, she heard the first stirrings of the ranch. Boots on gravel, a horse snorting in the cold air. Soon they would come, the 12 men who worked the Broken Arrow Ranch. They would sit at her table and eat her food, never looking at her face, never speaking her name. To them, she was just the cook, the widow woman who kept to herself and never smiled. They didn't know she was Thomas Reed's wife. They didn't know she watched them every morning through the kitchen window, memorizing their faces, learning their habits. The tall one with the scar across his left eye, he always sat at the head of the table. The young one with nervous hands, he picked at his food like a bird. The one who never removed his hat, he had killed her Thomas. Shot him in the back over a card game that meant nothing. Mary had seen it happen from the hill where she'd gone to pick wild sage. Watched her husband fall face first into the dust, while these men stood around like it was nothing more than spilled milk. By the time she reached him, the blood had already soaked deep into the earth. His eyes were open, staring at a sky he'd never see move again. The foreman had found her 3 days later, sitting by Thomas's grave with empty hands and emptier eyes. "You can work the kitchen," he'd said, not recognizing her beneath the dirt and grief. "We need a cook." She nodded, knowing they wouldn't take a woman who couldn't earn her keep, knowing she had nowhere else to go. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of feeding the men who had watched her husband die. 6 months of keeping her secret locked behind closed lips and downcast eyes. The coffee was ready. She poured it black and bitter into the big pot, the way they liked it. Her hands were steady now, trained by repetition and necessity. She added salt pork to the pan, listened to it pop and sizzle. The smell would bring them soon. It always did. Mary touched the small glass bottle in her apron pocket. Oleander extract, sweet and deadly, gathered drop by drop from the flowers that grew wild behind the barn. She'd learned about it from her mother, who'd learned from her mother before that. Just in case, the women in her family always said, a woman needs protection in this hard world. Every morning she touched that bottle. Every morning she chose not to use it. Not yet. The door opened without a knock. They never knocked. The tall one with the scar entered first, followed by the others. They filled her kitchen with the smell of tobacco and horse sweat, their spurs ringing against the floor like broken bells. She kept her back to them, stirring the pot with slow, careful movements. "Smells good, woman," one of them said. She didn't turn to see which one. It didn't matter. They were all the same to her now, shadows that moved and ate and laughed while her husband lay cold in the ground. She served them in silence, ladling stew into bowls, filling cups with coffee that steamed in the morning air. Her movements were those of ghost, present but not really there. They talked around her, through her, as if she were part of the furniture. Stories of cattle and weather, women in town, the price of beef. Normal things that seemed strange and far away, like voices heard through deep water. The one who never removed his hat sat in Thomas's chair. She watched him eat, watched the way his throat moved when he swallowed. He had rough hands, she noticed. Hands that had held a gun steady while her whole world fell apart. "Good stew," he said, not looking up. She nodded, saying nothing. Her voice had died with Thomas. She hadn't spoken a word since the day she'd taken this job, and they'd grown used to her silence. It made her invisible. It made her safe. When they finished, they left as they'd come, loud and careless, leaving their dishes for her to clean. She stood at the window and watched them head to the stables, to the work that would fill their day. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert gold and red. Somewhere out there, beyond the ranch boundaries, was the life she'd planned to live. The children she'd never have. The home she'd never build. Mary turned back to the kitchen, to the dishes and the endless routine that kept her hands busy while her heart learned the shape of its emptiness. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. But every morning, she touched the bottle in her pocket. Every morning, she made her choice. The pot still held warmth from the cooking. She ran her finger along its rim, feeling the smooth iron that had outlasted so much. In the quiet kitchen, with the ghosts of breakfast fading into memory, she almost heard it. The sound of Thomas's laughter, caught somewhere between the walls and her breaking heart. The mess hall emptied slow that night. Men drifted out in twos and threes, bellies full, minds turned to cards and whiskey. But Thomas stayed. He stacked plates without being asked, carried them to the wash basin with careful steps. His sleeves were rolled up, showing arms too thin for the guns he carried. Boys' arms, not yet hardened by years of riding and killing. Lila said nothing. She let him help, let him move through her kitchen like a ghost, trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things neither could say. He set the plates down gentle, like they might break. Everything he did was gentle. Strange for someone who rode with killers. Strange for someone who'd watched her husband die. My mother made cornbread every Sunday, he said suddenly. His voice was soft, barely louder than the water in the basin. Added honey when we had it. Sugar when we didn't. Even when there was nothing else, there was always cornbread. Lila's hands stopped moving in the soapy water. She waited. Rangers came when I was 14. Said my father was hiding stolen cattle. He wasn't, but they didn't care about truth. Thomas picked up a rag, started drying a plate that was already dry. They burned everything. The house, the barn, the fields. Made us watch. The candle on the counter flickered. Shadows danced on the walls. My mother tried to save her mother's Bible. Ran back into the house. His hands stopped moving. She didn't come out. Lila lifted a plate from the water, watched the suds slide down like tears. She knew this story. Not the details, but the shape of it. The West was full of such stories. Boys made into men by fire and loss. Men made into monsters by rage. That why you ride with them? She asked. First words she'd spoken to him direct. He set the plate down. Started out wanting justice. Then revenge. Then, he shrugged. Then I was just one of them. Doing what they do. Taking what we need. Running for what we done. She turned to look at him then. Really look. He was young. Maybe younger than 18. His face still had that softness boys carry before the world beats it out of them. But his eyes were old. Ancient. Like he'd lived 100 years in his short life. You were with him? She said. Not a question. Thomas's jaw tightened. Yes, ma'am. Tell me. He shook his head. You don't want to know. I dream it every night. See it different each time. Sometimes he's running. Sometimes fighting. Sometimes just standing there. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands gripped the edge of the basin. Tell me. Thomas looked at the floor. The boards were worn smooth, marked by years of boots and spilled food. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. We were scouting ahead. Me and him and 2 others. Supposed to be empty land. But they were waiting. Comancheros. Maybe 20 of them. He swallowed. Your husband. Eli. He saw them first. Could have run. Rest of us were already turning our horses. But the boy's voice cracked. He was trying not to cry. He charged them. Alone. Gave us time to get away. To warn the others. Thomas looked up, and tears were running down his face. I wanted to go back. Swear I did. But Carlos held me. Said Eli was already gone. Said dying with him wouldn't bring him back. Lila closed her eyes. She could see it now. Eli on his brown mare, hat low, rifle raised. Always the hero. Always thinking of others first. It's what she'd loved about him. What got him killed? He was brave, Thomas said. Braver than any of us. Brave men leave widows, Lila said. She turned back to the dishes. Cowards leave stories. The words hit him like a slap. She hadn't meant them to. Or maybe she had. She didn't know anymore. Cruelty and kindness felt the same these days. Both hurt. Thomas set down the rag. I'm sorry. For everything. For not dying with him. For eating your food. For being here when he's not. She heard him move toward the door. Heard his boots, too heavy for his young feet. She didn't turn around. But when he reached the threshold, she spoke. Thursday's baking day. I need flour from the storage shed. 20 pounds. Maybe 30. He stopped. Yes, ma'am. And Thomas. Ma'am, your mother's cornbread. With honey. I'll make some. If you want. She heard him breathe. Just breathe. Then, I'd like that. The door closed soft behind him. Lila stood alone in her kitchen, hands in cooling water, staring at nothing. Tomorrow she would bake bread. Knead dough until her arms ached. Watch it rise. Smell it brown. Cut it into thick slices for men who didn't deserve it. But tonight, she pulled out her wooden bowl. The big one, older than her marriage, older than her grief. She measured flour by feel, added salt, a precious bit of sugar. Started working water into the mix, slow and steady. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 1,000 loaves. But her mind was elsewhere. On a boy who'd lost his mother. On a man who'd lost his life. On the strange arithmetic of the West, where every gain meant someone else's loss. The dough came together under her palms. She pushed and folded, like trying to press all the broken pieces of the world into something whole, something that could rise. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Inside, the candle burned low, and a widow prepared bread for killers, wondering if feeding the lost could somehow bring back the dead. She covered the dough with a damp cloth. It would rise through the night, swelling with promise or threat. She couldn't tell which anymore. Tomorrow there would be bread, and the boy would come for flour. And maybe, in the space between mixing and baking, she would find something she'd lost, or lose something more. The dough waited beneath its shroud, patient as hope, dangerous as forgiveness. The winter came hard that year, harder than most folks remembered. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, and the wind found every crack in the old hideout walls. Sarah moved through the kitchen like a ghost wrapped in wool, her shawl pulled tight around shoulders that had grown thin. "Come here, boy," she said one morning when the frost lay thick. Her voice carried that soft quality it took on when the memories pressed too close. "Time you learned something useful." The boy, they still called him that, though he'd started shaving and his voice had found its depth, came to stand beside her at the wooden table. She'd already laid out the makings: flour in a chipped bowl, lard in a tin cup, salt in a small dish. Simple things. Necessary things. "My grandmother taught me this," she said, not looking at him. Back when the world was different, when a woman's worth was measured in the lightness of her biscuits and the tenderness of her heart. She showed him how to cut the lard into the flour with 2 knives, crossing and recrossing until the mixture looked like coarse sand. Her hands moved with practiced grace, though he noticed how they shook sometimes when she thought no one was watching. "The secret," she said, "is not to overwork it. Like people, dough gets tough when you handle it too much." The boy watched her face more than her hands. Something had changed in her these past weeks. The other men had noticed too. Black Jack had taken to studying her during meals, his dark eyes following her movements around the table. Tom kept asking why the stew tasted different lately, though he couldn't say how. "You all right, Miss Sarah?" the boy asked, keeping his voice low. She paused, her flour-dusted fingers still. Outside, the wind moaned through the canyon like a grieving woman. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held depths he couldn't fathom. "I'm teaching you this recipe," she said carefully, "because everyone should know how to make something with their own hands. Something simple and good." She turned back to the dough. Something that fills the belly and warms the soul, even when the world outside is cold. They worked in silence for a time, her hands guiding his as he learned the feel of ready dough. The kitchen filled with the comfortable sounds of preparation. The soft thud of dough on wood, the scrape of the rolling pin, the whisper of flour across the table's scarred surface. "Why do you stay?" the boy asked suddenly. The question had been building in him for weeks, maybe months. Sarah's hands stilled again. She looked toward the window, where ice crystals made patterns like cemetery gates against the glass. "Where would I go?" she asked softly. "My husband is in Tucson, buried in ground I'll never see again. My home is ashes. My life is—" She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the hideout, the men who owned her days. "This. You could leave. I could help you, no." The word came sharp, then softened. "No, child. This is my path now. We all have our paths to walk." She showed him how to cut the biscuits with an old tin cup, how to place them just so on the baking sheet. Her movements held a strange urgency, as if time was running short, and this lesson mattered more than he knew. That night at dinner, the boy noticed how she watched them all eat. Her gaze lingered on each face: Black Jack's cruel mouth, Tom's nervous hands, the others with their various sins written in scars and hard lines. Where her eyes found his, something in them made his chest tight. He started then, that very night, to taste her food before the others. Just a quick bite while helping serve, making sure it was good, making sure it was right. She noticed, of course. Her face would tighten with something that might have been pain, or might have been something else entirely. "You don't trust my cooking anymore?" she asked one evening, catching his wrist as he reached for a spoonful of stew. "I trust you," he said quickly. I want to make sure it's good. For them. For you." She held his gaze for a long moment, then released his wrist. "Foolish boy," she whispered, but there was tenderness in it. The days grew shorter and colder. Sarah taught him more recipes. Her mother's cornbread, her aunt's bean soup, the apple pie her sister used to make before the fever took her. Each lesson felt like a goodbye, though he couldn't say why. One night, Tom mentioned Tucson over dinner. Something about a bank there, easy pickings, maybe their next job come spring. Sarah's hand jerked, sending her water glass tumbling. As she knelt to clean the spill, the boy saw her shoulders shaking. "Clumsy woman," Black Jack muttered, but his eyes stayed on her too long. Later, in the kitchen, she stood at the window, looking out at the frozen darkness. The boy found her there, tears making silent tracks down her cheeks. "He's buried there," she said without turning. "In Tucson, under a cottonwood tree, or so they told me. I dream about that tree sometimes. Dream about its shade, about sitting there with him when the world turns warm again." The boy wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. He was learning to shoot, learning to ride, learning to survive in this hard world. But no one had taught him how to ease the kind of pain that lived in her eyes. "Teach me something else," he said finally. "Anything. I want to learn." She turned to him then, and her smile was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow I'll teach you something special. Something my grandmother saved for last." That night, the boy dreamed of cottonwood trees and poisoned wells, of biscuits that tasted like sorrow and women who carried death in their careful hands. He woke with a weight in his chest, a certainty that something was ending. But he was young, and the young believe they can save everyone. He was wrong. In the morning, Sarah was already in the kitchen, ingredients laid out on the table like an offering. She looked up when he entered, and her face held a terrible peace. "Today," she said quietly, "I teach you the most important recipe, the one that ends all hunger." The winter wind howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, a cottonwood tree waited beneath the weight of snow and memory. The kitchen smelled of sage and something darker. The widow stirred the pot with slow, careful circles, her wooden spoon scraping against iron like a shovel against stone. Steam rose from the stew, carrying the scent of wild herbs she'd gathered at dawn, some for flavor, some for other purposes. The 7 men sat around her table, their guns resting against chair legs, their eyes following her movements. They'd ridden in at sunset, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, asking for food and shelter. She'd seen their kind before, had buried one like them 3 months past in the hard ground behind the barn. "Smells good, ma'am," the leader said. His beard was gray with trail dust, his hands scarred from rope work. The others murmured agreement, their stomachs speaking louder than caution. She ladled the stew into bowls, one by one. Her hands stayed steady, though her heart beat like a trapped bird. The youngest sat at the table's end, barely 16, she guessed, with soft cheeks that hadn't yet learned to grow proper whiskers. His eyes reminded her of her nephew back east before the war took him. "Eat while it's hot," she said, setting the last bowl before the boy. The men didn't need telling twice. They hunched over their meals like wolves, spoons clicking against pottery. All except the boy, who held his spoon suspended above the dark broth, watching the others eat. The widow moved behind him, her hand finding his shoulder. Such thin bones beneath the dirty shirt. Such a weight for young shoulders to carry. "Not hungry?" she asked. "Just waiting," he said. His voice cracked on the word. The leader laughed through a mouthful of meat. "Boy's got manners. Probably the only one his mama taught him before we found him." The others chuckled, but their laughter was already growing strange. The big man at the table's middle blinked hard, shaking his head like a horse bothered by flies. Another pressed a hand to his stomach. The boy lifted his spoon. The widow watched the metal rise toward his lips, carrying its burden of broth and judgment. At the last moment, her hand shot out, knocking the bowl from his grasp. Stew splattered across the floor like spilled secrets. "Clumsy woman," the leader started to say, but the words came out slurred. His eyes went wide as understanding dawned. Around the table, the men began to fall. Not all at once, but in stages like wheat bending before wind. The big man went first, his face hitting the table with a sound like dropped meat. Another tried to stand, reaching for his gun, but his legs folded beneath him. The boy sat frozen, his empty hand still curved around an absent spoon. The widow knelt beside him, her hands, dusted white with flour from the morning's baking, framing his face. Her palms were cool against his burning cheeks. "Listen careful now," she said. 3 months back, men like these rode through. Shot my husband for the sin of owning a good horse. I found him in the dooryard, his blood mixing with the dust. The leader writhed on the floor, his mouth working soundlessly. The others lay still, or nearly so, their breathing growing shallow as pond water in drought. "I prayed for the strength to forgive," she continued. "Prayed until my knees went raw. Then I remembered how the Lord himself served supper to those who would betray him. How he washed the feet of his own Judas." The boy's eyes darted between her face and the dying man. I never killed nobody." "Not yet," she said. "But you were riding with them. Another year, maybe 2, and you'd have blood on those hands sure as sunrise." She stood, moving to the sideboard where a cloth bundle waited. Inside lay traveling bread, hard cheese, and dried meat, enough for several days' journey. She pressed it into his trembling hands. "The law will come looking when these men don't report back. They'll find them here, find a nightshade in their bellies. Find me, likely, and I'll tell them about the poison I meant for rats that somehow found its way into desperate men's stew." The boy clutched the bundle like a lifetime. "Why save me? Because someone should have saved my husband. Because mercy is harder than justice and more necessary. Because you remind me of a boy I knew who never got the chance to choose a different path." She helped him to his feet, guided him to the door. Outside, the horses stood patient in the moonlight, unaware their riders would never mount again. "Take the spotted mare," she said. "She's young and strong. Ride west to California. Gold country's full of men starting over, becoming someone new. Nobody there will ask what you left behind." The boy stood in the doorway, caught between the dying dark behind him and the uncertain light ahead. "What about you?" "I've got my own judgment to face. But I'll face it knowing I fed 7 killers their last supper and saved 1 boy from becoming the 8th. She watched him saddle the mare with shaking hands, watched him struggle to mount. When he looked back from the gate, she raised 1 flower-white hand in blessing or farewell. The sound of hoofbeats faded into darkness. Inside, the silence grew complete, broken only by the settling of the house and the soft whisper of her skirts as she returned to her kitchen. She sat at the table among the dead, her hands folded in her lap. Somewhere to the west, A boy rode toward a future she'd carved out of nightshade and mercy. The law would come with the sunrise, but for now, there was only the quiet and the cooling stew and a strange peace that comes from choosing who deserves to see another dawn.